Welcome to the U.S. Eagle Claw YouTube channel. Russia entered the war that would cause the greatest damage to itself throughout its history and faced an irreversible Great Depression. During the war, Russia rapidly consumed its military inventory, which it had spent a long time in. With Russia's invasion plan of Ukraine, its financial burden increased in many areas. The many moves made by Russian President Vladimir Putin to restore Russia's reputation during the war have increased the financial burden on Russia's shoulders many times over. With the start of the Ukrainian invasion, Western countries began to impose heavy sanctions on Russia. As a result of the sanctions of Western countries, the Russian economy and the arms industry suffered a great blow. European Union member states adopted new sanctions against Russia, including trade bans and a ceiling price on Russia's oil sales. According to the package, which aims to increase the pressure on the Russian government and economy and weaken Russia's military capability, additional restrictions were imposed on the transportation of crude oil and oil products from Russia to third countries. Providing technical services, intermediation, financing, or financial services are prohibited. As of February 2023, the provision of such services to petroleum products originating in Russia is included in the scope of the ban. Restrictions that could contribute to Russia's military and technological development or the defense and security sector were also expanded. The supply of various electronic components, chemicals, and goods in this field to Russia is prohibited. The sale, supply, transfer, or export of civilian firearms, their basic components, ammunition, military vehicles, and equipment or spare parts to Russia is prohibited. A transaction ban was imposed on the Russian Maritime Registry. The provision of services such as architecture, engineering, information technology, and legal advice to Russia is included in the scope of the ban. The provision of crypto asset wallets, accounts, or custody services to Russian individuals and institutions, regardless of their total value, is completely prohibited. Russia has wasted $82 billion of its 2022 budget, which was determined at the end of 2021 in the war in Ukraine. But this is not the only loss of Russia in the Ukraine war. Since February, the Russian Federation spends an average of $400 to $600 million per day on the Russian army and the war in Ukraine. The huge losses of the Russian army reveal this cost, and the cost of at least 10 years of training and experience of thousands of trained soldiers lost by Russia is among these losses. The Russian army lost at least 12 generals and more than 1,500 high-rank commanders, thousands of elite troops. The material dimension of this situation is immeasurable. While Russia is paying the price of the war with a very heavy financial loss, the sanctions and freezing of Russian assets by Western countries, and even the EU's seizure of $65 billion of Russian assets and sending them as aid to Ukraine are among Russia's major losses. All these losses represent a huge loss of $300 billion, excluding the value of experienced troops and commanders in the Russian army. The budget determined by the Kremlin government for 2022 activities was $340 billion. However, it's not known exactly how much was allocated to the Russian armed forces within this budget. It is a matter of curiosity how many billion dollars will be for the 2023 budget of the Kremlin government at the end of 2022. Although Russia is seen to have used approximately 25% of the budget it determined on the battlefield, almost all of the budget determined by the Kremlin government was used to protect itself from the effects of the war in order to keep Russia's economy collapsed as a result of the sanctions of Western countries. It has been observed by various analyses that the effect of the war on the Russian budget is approximately $300 billion. Before the war began, the Russian Federation was making about $1 billion a day for oil and gas. But now the situation is different. Revenues of the budget of the Russian Federation from oil and gas exports have decreased significantly. Russia has already lost most of the European gas market after stopping supply via Nord Stream. As we mentioned, in line with the new decision taken by Europe, sanctions against Russian oil came into effect as of December. Russia needs more money to continue the war that Vladimir Putin started and is waging aimlessly and without provocation. From the beginning of autumn, the cost of the war doubled for Russia. Now the cost of the war to Russia has reached at least $10 billion a month. Russia promised very high sums to its military personnel in Ukraine. thinking that the war would not last long. The Kremlin government has stated that it will pay the contracted soldiers of the Russian army $3,200 per month in salaries and additional payments for the war in Ukraine. By calculating a little, we can see that the Russian army spends on average about $200 per soldier per day. The Russian army tried to meet the military manpower that Ukraine lost as a result of the attack with Vladimir Putin's partial mobilization decision. In October, the number of soldiers in the Russian troops significantly increased. Although Vladimir Putin stated in his decree that 300,000 people would be mobilized, it is estimated that far more than 300,000 people were conscripted in the recruiting offices. Persons recruited as part of the mobilization will cost the Russian budget more than $2 billion per month. In addition, Russia should have increased the budget for the ammunition and equipment of the mobilized soldiers. However, Russia failed to do so and could not meet the needs of most of the mobilized soldiers. The total salary expenditure of Russia's army deployed in Ukraine with the participation of mobilized soldiers then approached nearly $4 billion. The number of casualties of the Russian army has increased sharply over the past 2 months. The unprepared mobilized soldiers sent to the front are seen as the reason for this situation. The increase in the number of soldiers who lost their lives again creates an additional cost to the budget of the Russian army. If the amount of compensation to be paid to the dead and wounded in the summer was estimated to be about $1 billion per month, it was observed that it exceeded $3.5 billion in the last month of the war. Since the beginning of the war, the Ukrainian authorities have implemented a policy of transparent information about the losses of the Russian army. And thanks to this policy, the whole world learned about Russian losses. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, we clearly see that the longer the war, the worse it gets for Russia. 17,470 Russian soldiers lost their lives in Ukraine in the last 30 days. Based on the 30 days of data, this number is a serious record. This reveals that even more Russian soldiers died in the first month of the war. It has been confirmed by various sources that more than 90,000 Russian soldiers have lost their lives since February 24th. The Kremlin government stated that $110,000 would be given to the families of each soldier who died in the war. If these two pieces of information are combined, it's estimated that the cost of the soldiers who lost their lives to Russia is approximately $10 billion. Thanks to Ukraine's railway infrastructure inherited from the Soviet Union, Russian troops quickly completed ammunition shipments to Ukraine. However, the Ukrainian forces destroyed hundreds of Russian ammunition depots thanks to the HIMARS supplied by the USA. The average price of a Soviet-caliber bullet is about $1,000. The Russians spent more than $5.5 billion supplying ammunition during the height of artillery strikes. At first, Russia used ammunition of domestic production. Now possible deliveries from North Korea are actively used. The active use of North Korean ammunition increases the cost of the war more for Russia. At the same time, the suicide drones that Russia procured from Iran and used to attack Ukraine's infrastructure also created an extra cost for Russia. Russian leader Vladimir Putin did not anticipate such a long war and predicted that his ammunition stock and production capabilities could meet his own needs. Russian missiles are manufactured at a high cost due to foreign components. The average cost of this is $3 million. Assuming that Russian forces fired more than 4,000 missiles in Ukraine, these attacks cost Russia about $12 billion. As a result of the heavy attacks of the Ukrainian army, Russia lost a lot of its military equipment or lost it to the Ukrainian army. Among the equipment that Russia lost are seriously expensive tanks and warplanes. The Russian Air Force lost 278 fighter jets, each costing an average of about $20 million. In addition, the Russian Air Force lost 261 combat helicopters in Ukraine, costing about $11 million. It is thought that the Russian Air Force, which lost approximately $10 billion during the war, cannot reproduce its losses due to the sanctions of the Western countries. For this reason, the Ukrainian Air Force will never be the same again. Tank battalions of the Russian land forces also lost a lot of equipment like the Air Force. For this reason, the Russian Air Force will never be the same again. Tank battalions of the Russian land forces also lost a lot of equipment like the Air Force. With the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the Russian army lost about 4,500 of its tanks. Tanks are the military equipment that the Kremlin government needs most if it is to succeed on the battlefield. and the Russian army, which lost a large number of tanks, decided to use the old tanks from the Soviet Union, which needed maintenance and modernization. It is certain that the tanks, which require many revisions to be used in Ukraine, will cause an additional cost for the Russian army. The cost of the tanks that the Russian army lost during the war is more than the planes it lost. It is stated that the Russian army lost about $21 billion of tanks during the war. Thank you for watching us.